start our discussion. And then I'll introduce Jesse.
On August 9th, 2014, a police officer in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri, shot and killed an unarmed 18-year-old. This incident quickly became a huge story, not only for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the predominant news organization in the region, but across the nation and even the world. The Post-Dispatch in the ensuing months has tried to not only cover the events that incident sparked, but to get behind the events and into the issues, the larger issues, the broader concerns that the shooting raised. Today we're going to hear from three key editors at the Post-Dispatch who will discuss what the news organization has done and how we've tried to cover that story and all its implications.
The Ferguson story, in my 30 years of doing journalism, I don't think we've ever seen a story that's been nearly as challenging. And it's from a couple different areas. Just from our whole staff, just trying to keep up with the ongoing story as well, and which just exploded, and I mean truly exploded. Almost 24 hours of our staff. We had to bulk up our night staff to cover protests that went on and that would come out, and just to keep up with everything else. But I think the biggest challenge for us is we could keep up with the daily stuff, but how do you do that and try to look at some of the more in-depth issues and the systemic issues that have caused Ferguson to happen in the first place? What it's brought out is just a look at our justice system in general and how it affects different parts of our community. Specifically, with so many municipalities here who have their own governments, their own police forces, and their own courts, we have been trying to take a closer look at the municipal court system here and how it affects those with money, those without, black, white, and we have more to do in that area. I think other systemic issues that have come up are just policing in general and how the police handle problems and how they interact with different parts of our community. It also includes the militarization of police and some of the things that we saw in the response to protesters here.
Well, one of the first stories we did, which was very shortly after the shooting, was why did it happen in Ferguson? Why was the shooting where it happened? And it happened in a low-income housing development. So one of our reporters just explored how that huge apartment complex came to be low income and high crime. So it wasn't surprising, actually, that the shooting would happen in that housing area because of the poverty and the crime. We also looked at just low-income housing. It's fine to say we should spread it out over the region, but we had a reporter who looked at a complex that was out in the suburbs, and people had to walk on the interstate in order to get to their jobs because they didn't have cars and there's no public transportation to speak of. Ferguson was just sort of emerging from the recession when the shooting happened, so we wrote about what this was going to do. It was badly hit by the housing bubble bursting, and it was just coming back. We wrote about that, but then we wrote about how housing sales continued even at the height of the protests this fall. And we did a look forward on whether business owners should rebuild or give it up, what kind of decisions they were going to make, and then covered what Ferguson is going to mean for the region as a whole. We obviously, you say Ferguson, you say St. Louis, around the world, and an image pops up. So what's going to be the long-term effect of that on our economy?
Small words make a big difference. We got into trouble with the community the very first day of the shooting when referring to the people who assembled outside as a mob in an online headline. And that angered the community, and they saw us as painting them in a certain light that created tensions all along. We also found in covering this that there are two separate audiences for the events. There's a live social media, online Twitter audience that wants minute detail as it happens in real time one protester here arrested, 2 people there charging the police, throwing a brick. And then there's a different audience, more often in print, but that we also follow up online in looking at the broader picture. A night's small event of 5 protesters arrested and a flashpoint with police does not necessarily reflect the entirety of the day and the events and the context of the interaction between the police and the community, and also then get at some of the broader issues that took place during that day or that cycle, both how the movement goes forward and how the coverage of that movement goes forward. And by movement, I said there's Ferguson, the suburb, the town where their buildings boarded up, there are people wondering, can we take those boards down because the violence is over and we can try to get back to a normal life and build on our community. People in Ferguson are trying to get minority representation on city council and whether they can move to a better place as a community to live in. But Ferguson has taken on this symbolic tone of race relations. And so the challenge for us is going to be, as journalists, is to find where the action is going on, and it will be on many fronts, and to not ignore one at the expense of the other, and to tell the whole picture of how this issue is playing out.
I think we were keenly aware from the beginning as this thing just grew, the interest level, and we were getting national media, international media coming to town, outside groups coming in with their own agendas, and every single thing that we did was being monitored. And so I think for our staff, we just caution folks, we just continue to do our job to try to be professional. But we knew this was a pressure cooker atmosphere here, and we tried to be as accurate and professional as we possibly could.
All right, so there are some things to think about before we start, and I just want to briefly introduce Jesse Holland. Is it Jess or Jesse?
Jesse.
Jesse Holland. He is the race, ethnicity, and demographics writer at Associated Press. He's also responsible for social media and social media training, and you can clarify exactly what those things mean. But he tweets a lot, and he's really good at it. And we've invited Jesse here to help us to help facilitate this discussion that we really want to have in this room about how we cover race, how we deal with race when it interacts with other parts of our beat, especially politics. We've got a presidential election coming up. There'll obviously be a lot of racial issues that will develop as the campaign moves forward. And I'm going to stop there and let you take over.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what I see my job as, and a little bit about me as well. Before becoming the race and ethnicity and demographics reporter at AP, I covered the White House for AP. I covered the Supreme Court. I actually just came off 5 years at the Supreme Court, and I've only been in this job since last February, and then about another 5 or 6 years covering Capitol Hill. I started this job as race and ethnicity reporter in February, and when people ask me what do, I write about people. I write about people and how they relate to each other. And I also want to welcome all of you to the race and ethnicity beat, because no matter what you're covering, you eventually will be writing about race and ethnicity. Another portion of my job is demographics. So I can tell you, no matter whether you're covering fashion, sports, politics, local news, in 2060, according to the census, America will be a minority-majority country. So we all will be writing about race and ethnicity, no matter what position we hold at newspapers. One of the things that we try to do at AP, and one of the things I try to do personally, and it was great seeing that video. I actually spent 4 days in Ferguson myself when the incident happened. And one of the things they were just talking about is how they were relating to Ferguson as a local story. But one of the things I do at AP is I try to find national trends. So ever since Ferguson, we've been tracking the trends around the nation and trying to see how and what's going to change in America, if anything, because of Ferguson. So we have several projects we're working on now, still based months later, based on what happened in Ferguson, to see how these incidents are changing America. I actually have a sit down, actually a television interview sit down with Congressman John Lewis on Wednesday, which this will be part of the topic when we sit down with him about the difference between Ferguson and Selma. So when you talk about race and ethnicity, basically what we're talking about is how people in America relate to each other. And a lot of times as reporters, especially here in Washington, we get stuck talking about policy. We get stuck talking about laws and regulations. But what this beat is about is people. We're writing about people and how people in America are relating to each other as when it comes to their race and then when it comes to ethnicity. Now, one of the things I want to help define here is what exactly is race and ethnicity, because those things are changing in America. Right now, for the AP, what we call race are the ones that we most commonly use are white, black, Asian, Native American, Native Hawaiian. Ethnicity is Hispanic origin. Now, those are two different things. We don't have a Hispanic race in America. We have a Hispanic ethnicity, and we run into a lot of problems in copy with that. And unfortunately, that's part of my job as well. As I also read AP copy and look for things like that because we're all learning. One of the things that we're working on as well is we're actually looking to write a race and ethnicity section for the AP style book. We didn't quite get finished in time this year because the new one's coming out soon, but we're hoping to get a proposal for that to be done in the future. Because just looking at the news, we see race and ethnicity is becoming more and more part of the daily lexicon of our news. And we all need to be proficient in being able to talk about it, even though it's sometimes very uncomfortable to talk about these things. But as journalists, we need to be able to talk about race and ethnicity in a confident and an unapologetic manner. I actually started my AP career in Columbia, South Carolina, a long time ago. And one of my first beats in South Carolina was covering the Klan. And as you can guess, it wasn't one of my favorite topics. But I had to learn
But
to.
I know they were great. Really happy to see you.
They actually were. They actually were. Even though I did turn down the personal one-on-one interview in the leader's home, wow, which was out at the end of a dirt road in Lexington, South Carolina. I'm like, sorry, dude, you got to come to me. Not going out there. But we have to learn to be able to talk about race and ethnicity comfortably, because it's a conversation that we're going to have more and more around the nation. Part of the conversation started, of course, with Barack Obama's election. But as the years have gone by, we've talked about it less and less until Ferguson. And now we're talking about it again. My beat is to help explore some of the issues that we need to talk about in America and how we relate to each other. For example, one of my first stories, and it amazes me, one of the most popular stories I've written so far hasn't been about Ferguson. It's been about Bill Cosby, because there was a race and ethnicity aspect to that story as well. But once again, I will tell you, it made me uncomfortable to write that story. But it was a story that needed to be written. I talked about in the story about how Bill Cosby is receiving less support in the African American community than other stars did, like Michael Jackson, like Kobe Bryant. Bill Cosby isn't receiving any of that type of support, and part of the reason why is because Bill Cosby has spent the last decade criticizing the black community. And so people are not going to his support as they did with the other stars. Now, I have received more email about that story than anything I've written about Ferguson. Not gonna venture to guess why, but these are conversations that we have in this beat. Now by the way, I can keep talking for like the next hour, but you guys don't want that, I promise you. So if there's anything I say that you have a question about, please stop me, raise your hand. I love questions. Yes.
I'm just curious, the evolution of your beat, was this something that AP's had for a while that you just moved into, or where did it come from?
The race and ethnicity beat has been in the Washington Bureau of AP for years. If I'm not mistaken, it started years and years ago. It actually was called Urban Affairs. And which, by the way, which is one of the terms I absolutely hate, because it assumes that all minorities live in urban areas. And coming from a farm in Mississippi, I can guarantee you that's not true. But it started years ago in the Washington Bureau as a urban affairs beat, and over the years it's changed into what's now race and ethnicity. There was a point, and I should just be clear that there was a point where there were two race and ethnicity writers at AP. There was a national writer, Jesse Washington, who covered race and ethnicity out of Pittsburgh. And then there was me here in Washington, and we also have a Hispanic affairs writer in Miami. And there's a Indian affairs team that works out of the West. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm the only person in AP doing this, but over the years it's evolved into more of a once again more of a race and ethnicity. And I also took in demographics. Which lets me explore and play around with census numbers. So there's been different iterations of the job. I brought demographics into it when I took over the job in February. But before that, there was a reporter. Suzanne Gamboa was a race and ethnicity writer in D.C., while Jesse Washington did more columns and column style writing. We don't do columns at AP, but he did more columns and analysis style writing out of Pittsburgh. But he has now moved on, so I'm sort of doing both. So, yes.
Now that you mentioned census, I thought that as a segue to the question. There's African and then there's African American.
Yes.
And there's a tension there, and I maybe I've only been in the U.S. for 7 years, so maybe
Only 7 years.
Yeah. But I feel like it's something that the media hasn't caught on to and the Census Bureau hasn't caught on to. I still check other, because I don't identify as white, I don't identify as African American, and there's no box for African. And in stories, an African person is probably going to be identified as black, but we don't identify as black, we identify as African. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Or Afro-Caribbean.
Then there's that too, yeah.
I'm trying to decide what I can say without spoiling any of the stories I plan to write. We've had these same conversations at AP about this. And the census is also taking some of this in consideration for the 2020 census. I actually had a conversation with the census director last week around some of these issues. We try to be as specific as possible when we identify people in copy. Sometimes we are not as good at it as we should be, because for people involved, there is a very clear difference between African and in America and African American. We don't always make a clear distinction between those two in our copy, but that's one of the things that I'm hoping, if we can ever get this style book section up and going, that we can make clearer when we report stories. Now, as far as the tension you're talking about goes, I have to tell you, I hear about it. I rarely see it. The majority of the conversation about the tension I hear comes from Africans in America. I never hear African Americans talk about that tension. That doesn't mean it's not true. And by the way, I hate those arguments. If I don't see it, it doesn't exist. And we hear a lot of those arguments over sexism and racism as well. Well, since it didn't happen to me, it can't really happen that way. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that I only hear it from one side. So maybe I can't really do a good job explaining why that is, but it is an issue worth exploring, and we've talked about that.
Yeah, I feel that the conversation about race and ethnicity tends to focus on black versus white.
Right.
But people forget that there's real African and African American. I have experienced it so many times that I don't take my kid to school on the bus anymore. I drive him to school and come back home. And I didn't experience that in Florida or in Arizona, but here I think because it's a huge African American and huge African population, it's probably going to be more predominant here than in other cities. I've never read much about it.
I will say that as race and ethnicity reporters, and there's a cadre of us at major newspapers, and we all know each other and we all read each other's stuff. We don't do the best job of coverage outside of white and black. And I get emails to that effect, to be completely honest with you. We need to do more of looking and exploring outside of the white black angle. But honestly, that's where most of the major tensions in America are. So given that most news organizations have exactly like one person doing it, that person is going to be spending most of his time writing about Ferguson and things coming out of that. Now, I actually just had a meeting with our political editor today to talk about what work we're going to be doing for the 2016 election, and that was one of the conversations we just had. That we need to look at voters outside of white and black voters, and what are they doing, and what it means for the future and for presidential elections. Yes.
I was going to ask you about that sort of false black-white binary that exists in a lot of news coverage. The other point I'd make is that so much coverage of race and ethnicity happens around times of conflict, and I think that also colors the reporting and colors the conversations around the reporting, because there's a disconnect, I think, between how race is lived and how it's presented in news coverage. So I wondered if you could speak to that in any way.
Let's see. I'm trying to decide what I can say and what I can't say. One of the things that I have noticed in my time on this job is that a lot of what the race and ethnicity reporters write about isn't noticed. And people don't notice that there are people covering race and ethnicity until there's a conflict. I've written literally dozens of stories this year that had nothing to do with racial conflict, but no one notices those. They're read only when there's a conflict in there. For example, one of the stories that I'm working on, and I'll spoil this one because I'm almost done with it, and nobody will be able to beat me to finishing it anyway. It's coming up for Black History Month is going to be about African American and Hispanic owned wineries. I mean, they exist. Which, by the way, I didn't know they existed until I started writing the story. Now, that's an example of a story that has no conflict in it at all. But when I write it, I'll be interested to see the reception that I get on the story. There are organizations like The Root and like Griot that write about these issues every single day, dozens of stories, but they're not noticed until they write about Ferguson or they write about Bill Cosby. That's when people notice them. So I guess I would sort of push back on the idea that all race and ethnicity reporting, or even the majority of it, is about conflict. Those are the stories that are noticed. But I mean, we're all journalists. We know what sells newspapers, and we know what drives TV ratings. But the coverage is there. It's just a matter of people looking for it, or frankly, it being sold in a better way where people will notice it. Yes, one and then two.
Oh, I was just,
Okay.
this is a technical question. That style guide that you're working on, you said it's not going to come out
If I'm lucky, it'll be done in a year.
That would be super useful.
I know. I should get you to write me a testimonial.
That was my question.
Is there any
too.
way for us to get like a pre?
What would be
I definitely can't do that.
Well, so what are some? I was gonna ask the same thing, and so I spent some time in local news in Chicago, and we talked about race very differently than you talk about it when you're like a political DC reporter. But one of the things we had to talk about was suspect descriptions.
Oh.
And when yeah, but I didn't know this. I didn't learn this in school, or but it was our rule as a newsroom, which we had to state so everyone understood, is you only use race in a suspect description as part of a fuller suspect description. If you cannot identify the person based on the suspect description in a lineup, you can't publish it. So you can't say a black male.
Right.
But I mean, what are some of the other? So that's just one I know of. But what are some of the other things that, as a journalist, you should be thinking about that you see traps sort of fall into over?
Well, and I'm glad they said it on the video, the Ferguson video. One of the things that I always look out for is the descriptions, not only of suspects, of situations. For example, what's the difference between a group of protesters and a mob? What's the difference between a mob and a gathering of people or onlookers? So one of the things that I keep myself an eye out for is, how are we describing the people in our stories? And one of the things, and there's TV people in here, but it's one of my biggest pet peeves when I watch local news here, and not just here in New York and in Memphis, when I go home to my parents, is who is being interviewed. Just for an example, just a local story I saw a couple of days ago. They did a story about a shooting in downtown D.C., and everyone they interviewed about the shooting was African American. The very next story was about how safe people feel in that neighborhood, and everyone they interviewed in that story was white. And I'm like, does nobody else in that station see this? When we talk about people committing crimes, and we interview nothing but African Americans. When we talk about people feeling safe in their homes, we interview nothing but whites. I mean, I'm sure that wasn't intentional, but those are optics we have to look at when we do reporting. And that's one of the things that once again, in talking to the political editor today, it's one of the things that we had a conversation about. We have to pay more attention to not just the facts of the story. We have to pay attention to how we present those same facts. And this is not to be politically correct, which, by the way, I hate the word politically correct. I prefer the word, this is just to be accurate. So, I'll step off my soapbox now. So, any other questions?
Do you have any non-minorities in your race and demographics and census team?
Well, right now that whole team is me here in Washington. So the answer to your question is no. But I was actually talking to a Georgetown class in December, and I said to them that we know that race and ethnicity has become mainstream when a company hires a non-minority to cover it. Most of the race and ethnicity reporters that I deal with, that I see every day, are minorities. Now, in the past, that wasn't true, but nowadays, it's mostly minorities. But to answer your specific question, not all of our people on our team are minorities. We have some of the people who work out west are not. But the Hispanic Affairs reporter is Hispanic. Yeah, it's Laura and me, yeah. So, yes?
I was going to ask a slightly similar question. I'm wondering what you think of how political reporters who are not specifically on your beat, how they cover race, and also whether, especially in Obama's first term, where he rarely spoke about race in sort of a very overt way, did that change the way that reporters who are not specifically on your beat approach the issue of race in his presidency and himself?
The second part of that question is hard for me to answer, having not dealt directly with those reporters who were covering Obama at that time. But I will say that while I will say I slightly disagree with the contention that Obama did not talk about race in his first term. He didn't talk about race in the way that several people wanted him to. But remember the beer summit? I mean, those conversations happened. But he didn't, Jeremiah Wright. I mean, it's not like he didn't talk about race in his first term. He just didn't do it in the way that a lot of people would have liked him to. But I
agree with that point completely. But there was a narrative that took root in the last couple of years that Obama's not talking about race. This was something that the mainstream media reported on a lot, and I agree with you that he talked about it in so many different ways. But a lot of people were saying for years that he doesn't do that enough, or doesn't have speeches that are like his Philadelphia speech, where he's addressing the issue head on, or when he spoke in personal terms after the Trayvon Martin shooting, everybody said, "Oh my God, he never does this, and now he's doing it now." So where was that coming from?
Well, I'll play devil's advocate a little bit here and ask the question of how many times did George Bush talk about race while he was in office? Now, does Obama have a greater responsibility to talk about race because he's black? I don't know. I know what my answer to that would be, but I don't know. It seems like we hold him, because he's the first African American president, to a different standard in talking about race. Once again, should he have done something different than what he did in his first term? There are a lot of people who would say yes. Did it affect how race was covered in the United States? I don't know. I don't know if I can say yes to that. I think the coverage would have happened probably the exact same way it did regardless. There are a lot of great people covering the White House, including our White House team. And I get calls from them every once in a while saying, "Hey, what do you think about this? What should we say about this?" And each time I get a call from them, I say, "Well, this is what I think, and this is what we should do." And then they take it to their editor and they make a decision about what's going to be done. So I don't know if Obama saying anything different would have changed the coverage. There were a lot of, one of the major narratives that was pushed. Another one of those words that bothers me, narrative. Another narrative that was pushed was the post-racial America directly after Obama's election, and you will have a lot of people who will tell you that even from the beginning that that didn't happen, it didn't exist. But I can't say that the coverage. I can't say I believe that the coverage would have been any different if Obama had said anything differently. And of course, you also have to keep in mind Obama's the president. There are quite a few presidents who use proxies to say the things that they don't want to or just don't think they should say. And one of the people that he used for that was Eric Holder. So we paid a lot of attention to what Eric Holder says, thinking, and whether true or not, that Holder's probably saying what the president wants to say, but just doesn't.
Do you think that reporters who aren't expert on this beat or haven't devoted a lot of time to this feel comfortable writing about it, or are there ways that they could learn? I mean, that's part of what you're trying to do, right? Is figure out ways that people can become more comfortable engaging.
One of my directives from our bureau chief is to work more with our bureaus around the nation to help people become more comfortable with this type of writing. And it's one of the things that I try to do. We're working on a 50-state project this year that hopefully will see the light of day before the end of this year. But once again, it's becoming more comfortable with the terms and with the issues that you're talking about. Because frankly, we're going to be writing about this more and more. I actually said to a colleague of mine that I suspect that as it exists now, race and ethnicity reporters will be extinct in 20 to 25 years, because we'll all be writing about it. Every job will be about race and ethnicity, so it won't require a dedicated person anymore, because everyone will be doing. And she disagrees with me, and I sort of, since it's my job, I sort of backed off that a little bit myself. But more and more, we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity in everything. And so we're going to have to be more knowledgeable and more able to discuss these issues in print and on television. Yes?
Beyond just the census
We were, once again, I'm trying to, no, I'm not going to say that part. I spend a lot of my resources, frankly, I spend more time on the phone now than I did in any other point except when I was on the Hill. I also spend a lot of time on, frankly, on the internet.
Are there certain websites or departments you use in the federal government?
I'm trying to decide if I want to give away my stuff, my super secret stuff. I actually spend a lot of time talking to interest groups, Leadership Conference, NAACP, Ferguson Action now, actually. They have a surprisingly strong network. For a group that didn't exist 7 months ago, they have a surprisingly strong network. And I actually am now spending more time mining university professors. One of my personal passions is history, and how history relates to what's going on today. So I'm writing a series of stories for Black History Month, dealing with African American history. So right now I'm pushing with a lot of university professors, who, despite being in their academic ivory towers, are surprisingly knowledgeable about things going on outside of their universities, because they frankly spend all their time studying this, and are much easier to get information out of than your basic DC politician. So, Clarissa, yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about the social media aspect of the coverage, because it caught my attention in the clip what an editor said, that there's the social media audience that wants minute by minute updates, and then there's the broader audience that just wants the big story at the end of the day. So if you could talk about that and how that affected your coverage of Ferguson and just racial stories. And also something that I noticed on social media is that for me during Ferguson, I saw so many traditional media reporters from the big outlets trying to both be pundits and reporters at the same time. And I mean, Washington Post, like I can name other news organizations. I know at the AP, we're very defined as to what we're supposed to do. But when you see that, like, how does that affect the way you approach a story? Like, do you feel like you want to be more vocal? Or, I mean, because you see these reporters obviously sharing a lot of personal thoughts, and then I'm sure we all have them, but we're just not on social media putting them out there. And I saw it from, again, major news organizations, reporters from major news organizations doing that. So,
well, one of the well, let me give you a little bit of my social media background. I am the manager of the AP Politics Twitter site that AP runs out of DC, manager of the AP Courtside Twitter site that's run out of DC, and the manager of the AP Politics Facebook page.
So what do you do in your spare time?
Yeah.
I'm also writing a book. So basically what I do in this role is, back when I started the role, I did training for reporters on this is what we can and cannot do with social media. And being the AP, we have a very strict definition of what we can and cannot do, which is why you didn't see very many AP reporters tweeting out of Ferguson, simply because our rule is that if it's important, it needs to go on the wire first. After it goes on the wire, then we can feel free to talk about whatever it is that we are seeing or what we're doing. But if it's important, basically, if it's important enough to tweet, it's important enough to get into the story. So the story always comes first. So it was a bit easier for us in situations and places out of Ferguson, because we only tweeted what was in our stories. Now, there are a lot of news organizations who run social media outfits, which I've talked to some of them as well, who completely disagree with our policy on this. They say when you see it, you should tweet it. But we just don't work like that. The wire always comes first. And then after the wire, you can feel free to tweet. There are some situations in which we relax that rule. We started the Twitter feed here in Washington on the day of Obama's inauguration. Was it second inauguration? I forget how long ago this was now. And we live tweeted that. And we live tweet the State of the Union. And there are other breaking news events in which we will live tweet, but the majority of the material that we put out on social media is strictly material that's on the wire or after the story has already moved. And that while that does limit us in some ways, if you're looking for live tweets about a breaking news event out of wherever, we're probably not where you're going to go, because you're going to only get material that is either in the story or has been determined as not important enough to put in the story. Like I said, sometimes depending on the issue, we'll relax those rules. But one of the things that we're doing more and more of, and that we're trying to do in the future, is mesh social media into our stories a lot more. We ran a project during the midterm elections out of our bureau, where we actually used Instagram to do instant analysis during the election, as we were counting votes in the bureau, which was the first time we've done something like that.
How would you use Instagram to do that?
We took videos of we had the reporters and the analysts who were looking at the votes coming in around the nation, and we would basically get a phone and we'd interview them. You do 15-second clips. I said Instagram, Vimeo. Okay. Sorry, my fault. I said Instagram. We did video of the reporters explaining what they were seeing as the votes were coming in. Once again, that was an experiment. We didn't even really tell anybody we were doing it. We just did it and to see how it would work out. And we're still doing the analysis of how that worked out and whether it's worth doing again. But we're experimenting using social media in new and different ways. One of the things that we used to do, and I need to get us back into doing this, is doing Twitter chats after major stories move. It's harder for us to do that in Washington, because as soon as you move your story, you're already at work on the next story. So it's hard to tell someone that, hey, I need 30 minutes of your time to sit and talk to people on Twitter or on Google+. But we're trying to integrate more social media into what we're doing at AP. But you also have to keep in mind, AP is sort of a different creature than most news organizations, considering we're not a customer-facing organization. We sell to media organizations and not to the public. So it's a little harder for us to reach the reader than it would be for any of you. Did I answer your question in there anywhere?
I think you did.
Okay. Okay. I know. Sometimes I just go on. It's 1, 2, 3.
Okay. I'm going to start this with a short story.
Okay.
Very short. So there's one time I was on Twitter, and there was a journalist he's a tech reporter, and he said something about women that made me go, say what? And I tweeted at him, kind of say what? And he deleted it. And then messaged
He deleted your tweet?
He deleted his tweet.
Ah.
And then he messaged me saying thanks for the catch.
Right.
And that got me thinking, so what's the appropriate thing to do? the day when you mess up. You say something that's wrong or off key or something, and suddenly there are people like me going after you. What sort of, I mean, I don't know, is damage control a bad way to put it? Like,
well, I mean, no, I mean,
or like how, or like if it's just off key, it could be right, but just offensive to many people. How do you respond to
So
that?
Elizabeth, the person that you tweeted at,
Yeah.
he deleted his tweet. Did he apologize? Did he do anything public, or he just
did
sucked
nothing
it back?
public, he just sucked it back and private messaged me and says,
Right.
thank you for catching that, that's not what I meant.
So what did he say?
He was talking about Google and hiring women, and he said something to the effect of like, if there were more women about Google, they would be all about parenting class. It just basically made it sound like if there were more women in the tech industry, we would they would be more concerned about babies all the time, and it's just like,
Right.
So your question is, if you screw up on race
Right.
accidentally,
Yeah.
wrong tone, whatever it is, do you apologize? Do you take it back? Do you defend? I mean,
well, let me say this as far as social media goes. Once you post something, it's there. Deleting it does absolutely, positively no good at all. So our policy is that if we make a mistake on social media, we immediately issue a correction on social media, just as we would in print or on broadcast. We would correct it. We would say, this is the correction. Now, I will say that luckily for us, most of the things we tweet on our main accounts are straight news stories and analysis, so we have less to worry about when it comes to people just saying the first thing off the top of their head, which is one of the things I said. One of the first things I said to our political reporters when we got into tweeting: do not say the first thing that comes off the top of your head.
Well, what is your policy for? Because I think that's part of the question too. Is like a lot of us are our brand on Twitter, but we also represent our publication, and like my publication tells us, you have some authority. These are the things we want you to think about. But there have also been people at my institution who've been fired because of what they got into on Twitter because they didn't judge things properly. So, in your opinion, like, what does the AP tell its reporters about where the line between their brand and your brand stops on Twitter?
There's actually a long document on ap.org that lays out our social media policy for all of our employees, which every few months or so I send out again and say, hey, I know you didn't read this the first 3 times I sent it to you, but read this now. That is a question that we still haven't completely answered to my satisfaction. Where does my tweeting stop and my tweeting as an AP journalist begin? I will tell you that because of one of the examples you just gave, not that I've done anything like this, like that, I am very hesitant to tweet ideas and thoughts out of my head. If you look at my social media accounts, you'll see mostly pictures of my children. Every once in a while, I will post a story that I wrote that I actually think was pretty good. But I do not have conversations with people about my work on any of my social media feeds. Because, once again, tweeting is so immediate and posting on social media is so immediate that you don't want to say something that can come back and haunt you. I look at tweeting like the same way I look at emails. I don't hit send on the email until I've read it 2 or 3 times, because once it's sent, it's hard to recall. And social media is the exact same way. Once you hit that button that says tweet or post, it's going to be very hard to recall. So, as public figures, which all journalists are public figures, there's always someone out there willing and trying to get you to say something to further their agenda.
But the point that I was making when I asked you that question is that during the Ferguson coverage and the New York City coverage of the Cold incident, you did see a lot of journalists having these really toxic conversations on Twitter. And I mean, I don't know what you can say about that, but I don't know how others, stand on this, but I don't know what. that line as a journalist, once you cross it, I just feel like there's no going back, especially when it comes to race issues, when you put yourself out there like that.
Well,
I'm sorry, can you be a little more specific about the kinds of conversations?
Oh, sure.
you're
So,
talking
for
about?
example, there's a Washington Post reporter who has gone back and forth on Twitter with multiple people who criticize his reporting, and these are like dozens.
I think I know who you're talking about.
And we all know, and I'm not gonna.
I think I know who you're talking about.
It's not gonna come out of my mouth, but we all know who this person is. It's a Washington Post reporter who's been on the Ferguson coverage, and I'm just like, I just feel like, okay, what? but I feel like it affects us as journalists. You know, I feel like the behavior of
someone
one.
got into it from he started taking shots at my institution and
mean,
like.
Well, I mean-
I don't think that's why I didn't want to bring up.
Without talking about anyone specifically.
Yeah,
That's why I didn't.
no, but I mean, I'm not saying whether that was appropriate, but it became this thing.
Yeah, and then it's
became
like
more than the story.
It
Right.
became, and then I think it like because we're all in this together as journalists. Like if we have one journalist or any journalist acting out like that on such a major story, then it impacts the credibility of all of us when we're covering race and ethnicity issues. It doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Part of our job as journalists, and part of our responsibility as journalists, is not just to report the news, but also to educate the public on what we do and who we are. Every time I speak to a public organization, one of the first things I tell them is that there's a difference between news and opinion. And the public has a responsibility of being able to tell the difference between news and opinion, and we as journalists have a responsibility of clearly defining that line. There are some people, like you say, who like to straddle that line. I do think that people who straddle the line between news and opinion do us all a disservice, especially for those of us who like our news side of it and don't want to hear complaints about what the editorial page said today, or what this commentator said about this, or what this blogger said about this. I'm loath to criticize anyone for what they do, because everyone has their own thing. But if someone at AP asked me for my opinion about their social media accounts, I would tell them, do not put anything on there that you wouldn't be willing to put on the wire, because it's going to be treated as such. You are, even though it's your name, you're tweeting representing everyone from AP. So you must be doubly careful, triply careful about what you put out there. And now, is that an unfair restriction to put on people who, yes, to be completely honest, yes it is. But unfortunately, at this point, the public only sees the organizations. They don't see the individual reporters. If I tweet out something from my account and it's controversial, the first thing that is said about it is not going to be this guy from Washington, D.C. said this. It's going to be an Associated Press reporter from Washington, D.C. said this. So I have that responsibility as a journalist to understand how the public's going to receive whatever I say. So.
Isn't some form of bias already applied in the sense, whenever there's a black issue, CNN will send Don Lemon. So already I'm like, why don't you send Ruth Baldwin to cover black issues? You're sending somebody who's black. So for me, I really don't expect any objectivity. I guess I expect them to be fair in their coverage, but I already know they have a side.
Well, I mean,
if you have me covering women issues, I have a side. If you have me covering African issues, I have a side. So if my news organization sent me to cover that, I'd be like, no, my biases are probably going to seep through. I don't know, I feel like it's...
I will tell you that the cadre of reporters who were in Ferguson the first two times, we've actually gotten together and talked at different issues where we've been asked to speak about it, and almost to a man, we all volunteered to go. None of us were sent. They asked who wants to go, and I said I'll go. So I don't know. I can only speak for the people that I've talked to. Very few of the people in our little group of like 10 people who see each other all at the same events. All of us volunteered to go. None of us were said, no, they didn't look at the bureau and say, okay, you're going, and not you. We said, we'll go. I mean, frankly, that's part of our instincts as reporters. If something's going on, you sort of want to be there. I will tell you that I was hesitant at first to go simply because I had so many other family issues going on in Washington where I had to find somebody to take care of the kids, et cetera, et cetera. But the story was too big for me not to go. So when they came back and said, okay, we want someone to go, will you go? I said, sure. So I don't know if it's more of an issue. I mean, in the same way when it's dealing with women's issues, I don't think it's more of an issue organizations pick a woman to go. I think people volunteer for things that they're interested in. I mean, I wasn't assigned this beat. I asked for it. I volunteered to do this beat because I'm interested in it. And I think a lot of times you see the people you see covering things are the people who are interested in them. It's not just that these are the people who were chosen to go do this. They said, I'll do it.
And I do have a question, but also, I mean, that's not to say that a man covering women's issues wouldn't have a bias, or a white person covering Ferguson wouldn't. I mean, like, it's also, we as journalists constantly grapple with the fact that we all are people, just like
Right.
judges or whatever. Like, we have to
First and
all
foremost.
still bring things to the table, and it's up to you as a journalist to figure out how you separate or question your own biases when reporting something. And some are good and some may not be.
I mean, just like you're saying, believe me.
Man can't be the default.
Right.
Like the default can't be, if I'm none of these things, I'm a good biasless
Right.
reporter.
Well, I mean, just like we were talking.
Polarizing things. That's where I'm reluctant to expect a lot of objectivity, or I don't know. I would
Well,
be very
it's
careful. I would
part of being a
judge
journalist.
especially somebody in a very major polarizing issue that they probably down the line have had some personal experience
Well,
with that.
let me be specific about this then. I had a very definite opinion about the Klan. I still have a very definite opinion about the Klan. However, when I was assigned, I didn't volunteer to cover the Klan. When I was assigned to cover the Klan in South Carolina, my job as a journalist is to put my personal opinion aside and write the best story I can. Now, when the first story came out, the Grand Wizard called me. And I didn't say how'd you get my number, but that's all. The Grand Wizard called me and he said, I don't like a single word you just wrote, but it was fair. And as a journalist, that's all you're shooting for. They don't have to like what you write as long as they can't argue that it's inaccurate. It is what he said, and I wrote what he said. And so every situation you have, you're not human if you don't have an opinion about it. However, our jobs as a journalist, not as commentators, not as bloggers, our jobs as journalists is to put our personal opinion aside and write the best story that we can. 1, 2, 3.
Quick follow-up. So that story you're doing about the Hispanic and Black winery owners, do you back into the fact that they're Hispanic or Black, or did you set it up as, here's this winery, and can you believe it's owned by a Black guy?
Well, I sincerely doubt that'll be the lead. But
my point is, like, because the thing is that with the coverage of race and ethnicity, it's always like people who are minorities are always set apart as the other or as the exception. When a story like that can be written about the merits of this really good winery.
Well, considering that I have not written the lead of the story yet, I will tell you that I probably will not mention the fact that the winery is African American owned or Hispanic owned in the lead. So I probably will not take that tact. But the reason why I'm writing about it is because there are less than 1% of the wineries out there.
Will you mention it in the headline? Whoever writes the headline will probably end up hitting something about it.
Maybe, maybe not. I'll probably end up writing the headline too.
How do you get that statistic?
You count the number of wineries, and I mean, there are organizations that track these things. There are organizations that track these things. The ownership. the ownership of they track the ownership of every licensed winery.
And is it like a wine industry association, or is it like?
I don't know if I'm getting into that much detail about the story. That's not
Okay, but wait,
that hasn't been published yet.
But you said in the beginning that you did not know this particular figure before you started reporting. So what was the genesis of the idea? Was it that
the genesis? I can say this much. The genesis of the idea was that was a friend of a friend was offered a opportunity to run a winery in California, and he was black. And I said, wow, I'd not heard of many African Americans who run wineries. And that got me thinking. And I went from there. That's how the idea came about. I mean, as we all know, their microbrews are huge. I don't know how many African American, Hispanic, or Asian microbrews are there in America. But I think someone wrote that story last year. So I'm taking it to the next level. So I mean, I'm not setting this up as, wow, look at what these minorities can do. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying, look at this interesting thing that's out there. Look at these interesting people that are out there. I mean, once again, the job is about people. If I can find something interesting to write about people, that's what I'm going to do. I saw the next. Oh yes, you were the next. Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to what you were talking about like putting opinions aside and facts, whether or not you're dealing with a clan or any other story. Certainly, like that's true, and journalists need to do that. But it just reminded me of sort of like the debate between like the Glenn Greenwald types and the Bill Color, like that. And I think that's still sort of like in flux, especially in the internet era. Like there are, like, I would say, a growing number of, if you don't want to call them journalists, people who write about news who are kind of taking it.
Commentators.
I mean, they would. Glenn Greenwald would say that he is a commentator sometimes, but when he writes about NSA Snowden leaks, that is news, that is reporting, and he did win a Pulitzer Prize for it. I'm not like defending him.
Right. No.
It is like a trend that's like happening, and then I wanted to link it to sort of the Wesley Lowery Twitter thing. Like, I'm
Who?
Wesley Lowery.
Who?
Yeah. Well, sorry. The Amorphous Washington Post. No one in the room knows who it is. I'm not gonna defend like his use of Twitter or anything.
Right.
Like, I'll let you guys decide that. But we live in an age where like it matters, right, to a lot of employers what your reach is on Twitter, and the fact that he has 150,000 followers or whatever, that makes him a more marketable employee. And then
until he says something he shouldn't.
Until he says something he shouldn't, and then so it's a risk he's taking, absolutely. But it also he's talked about this issue. He's addressed it with, you mentioned your publication, and he's gotten a lot of fights about it. But I think there is a certain feeling among some reporters that these perspectives have been historically underrepresented in journalism and still are today, and that's sort of the line that, well, you need to be only totally stating and objective and represent both sides or whatever. Certainly you still need to strive toward that, but that there is something being accomplished by sort of being a little bit of an agitator sometimes. And again, I'm not defending that, I'm just
right.
I thought that side wasn't.
Well, one of the things that I can say as a definitive fact is that journalism is always evolving. The way we report now is not the way that newspapers were written 40 years ago. The way we're writing now may or may not be the way that journalism's accomplished 20 years from now. So I will not put down how anyone else does their form of journalism. I will say that for me at AP, I don't take that path. Right. Because I don't see what it accomplishes for me as a journalist to have conversations with non-sources on the internet. Now, if you are a source that I need for something, yes, I will have conversation with you on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, or wherever, on Pinterest, or wherever. I have accounts on all of them. However, I don't see, and I should say other AP journalists disagree with me. I don't respond to criticism that comes by email either. because I don't see how it helps me to have an argument with someone over the internet, especially in a format where it can be cut, pasted, and used in whatever way that person wants to make their point. So it doesn't help me to do that. So if I'm not going to do it by email, I'm definitely not going to do it on social media. But there are some employers that value you having those 100,000 followers that hang on your every word, and there are some AP reporters that have that kind of following. I do not. I'm not looking for that kind of following. I'm using social media as a tool to forward my journalism, and discussing someone's opinion of what I wrote does not do that for me. So, let me get you in the back, and then
How do you think that gender and gender politics play into your beat?
Right at this very second, they do not only, and they only play into my beat under the demographics wing so far. But as soon as I clear some stuff off my plate, I want to include gender politics because I think it's undercovered. I have a lot of stuff on my plate right now, and I almost today suggested to the political editor that I include gender politics, but then I thought about all the stuff I had to do before the end of this week and said it's probably not a good idea to add something else onto what you're doing. I think it's incredibly undercovered right now. As a beat, no. But we are actually in the middle of our reshuffling, and it did not show up on anyone's assignment list in Washington, which makes me think that.
What would have to happen for that? I mean, you talk about how your beat is ascendant and demographic changes are going to maybe even make it irrelevant at some point to everything writing about it. But what would have to happen for AP or for other organizations to say we want to create these beats?
Well, one, it would take a reporter to say, I want to do this. I mean, we could have someone focusing on gender politics right now if someone said, I want to do this in addition to everything else I'm doing. They're not going to hire a new person to do that. Somebody would have, this is why I'm doing social media. I started doing social media while I was still at the Supreme Court because I thought it needed to be done and they weren't going to hire anyone to do it. So I said, I'll take it on with everything else I'm doing. And one of the things I will say about AP is that AP is very good about letting people do the things that they want to do as long as you do it in addition to the things that AP wants you to do. So if I had said to our political editor today, I would like to cover gender politics, he would have said, sure, great, take it on. Let me know what you have next week. And then I'd have to go back upstairs and talk to my editor and say, hey, in addition to the 15 things you want me to do, I'm going to do this too. And she would say, great, as long as you get my stuff in too. Now, what would it take for an organization to decide they want to hire someone to do this? It would take a topic becoming so topical. It would take the issue becoming so topical that a organization would have to say, our coverage is incomplete without someone focusing on this full time. I would suspect that you'll see a lot more people paying attention to gender politics after Hillary Clinton makes her decision on whether she's going to run for president or not. If she does run for president, then you'll see a lot of more people taking on gender politics. If she doesn't run for president, I don't know what will happen to the issues then. Whether they'll just be folded into other copy, or whether people will decide they need to have a dedicated reporter to do that. And once again, I think right now, today, regardless of what Hillary Clinton says about running for president, gender politics is a completely undercovered and wide open area for any reporter who wants to do it. But Sandy has her hand up, so I have to skip back to Sandy.
I just have to interject here that for
in the 1970s and 80s, and Linda may have experienced this as well. Women were naturally assigned to gender and female issues, and we ran away from that as soon as we could. That's why, there are no more women's sections or life sections or culture sections. They're not about women and recipes and Pinterest type issues, if you will. But it actually raises an interesting question to me, because women ran so hard from that classification. How does that differ from the reporters that have gravitated toward covering minority issues? Do you have an opinion on that?
I have a definite opinion on that, because I almost did not approach my bureau chief about the race and ethnicity job, because I did not want to be pigeonholed as the black guy writing about race. The same, just to be completely honest, the same reason why I never want to do sports, because I did not want to be the black guy covering sports. Because sometimes once you get pigeonholed as that person, it's very hard to get out of that perception in people's minds. But my decision was, I am so interested in this topic that I'm willing to take the chance that I will be pigeonholed as one of these, as one of those race reporters. I have to say, I do acknowledge that I have always and will always have a concern about being pigeonholed as a reporter who can do this. But I'm willing to let my record before taking this job stand as I have proven that I can do other things. But there is that, and there is that concern. And I think I sort of cheated you on your question about people being assigned to certain stories, because that's exactly what Sandy's talking about. There is a perception that if there's an issue going on that pertains to African Americans, you need to have African American covered. If there's a perception that if there's a issue going on that deals with women, you need to have a woman covered. I do not prescribe to that at all. I think, and I have written about women's issues, I think, as well as someone else could have. I've written about non-minority issues just as well as anybody else could have. And I think as a journalist, our job is to approach each situation and do the best job that we can. But there is that perception issue, and frankly, that's a reason why there are not. I should say there are not many non-whites that cover race and ethnicity. And once again, like I said to the Georgetown group, we know that things have changed when you see non-whites assigned or volunteering to cover race and ethnicity. When we see men assigned to cover gender issues. Because the assumption is that if you're talking about gender issues, you're not talking about men, you're talking about women. Gender means both. So, and it's going to be one of the interesting things. It's going to be one of the interesting things in 40 years when the demographic shift happens. Race and ethnicity reporters will have to include whites, because they will, for the first time, be a minority. So yeah, I'm going to be interested, not that I'll still be covering race and ethnicity 40 years from now, but it'll be interesting to see how that shift happens in the future. Yes, finally, your question. Yes.
I'm curious how you deal with the regional issues at play here. I'm actually from St. Louis, and so when Ferguson blew up, I sort of got it.
Right.
I'm familiar with the race politics. My younger sister, ended up moving to Florida and has been living in Florida. And when you mentioned African, her boyfriend is Afro-Caribbean, and they talk about how they see themselves fitting into the race, and it's so different. I mean, everywhere in the country, race is perceived so differently. So how do you, as a national race reporter, try to grapple with that issue?
Getting on the ground and talking to as many people as possible. Honestly, this is one of the jobs where you cannot do it from behind a desk. Because if you do, you will make that critical mistake that will get 10,000 emails sent to you clogging up your email box. You will the blah 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 blah. The best thing with this beat to do is to actually, if you have the opportunity, go out and actually talk to the people you're reporting on. That's one of the reasons why I do so much partnering with our local bureaus, because if there's an issue going on, I can't get there. I need somebody to go out and actually talk to the people. I can do as much as I can by phone, but frankly, you're not going to get that conversation from a barbershop over a phone. You're not going to get the conversation from the church social over a phone. Somebody needs to be there to actually talk to the people and get those nuances that you're not able to get over the phone. That's why a lot of my stories you'll see there. A lot of my stories you'll see Jesse Holland and somebody else, and that "and" person is usually wherever the issue is happening, because that person has been assigned or requested to go out and actually make sure we get those nuances. Because I won't be able. I can try my best to get them by phone, but it's going to be very hard for me to do all of that by phone. Somebody actually needs to have their feet on the ground, talking to the people that you are actually writing about.
That is a very good note on which we can stop this, because we all know, have your feet on the ground, best reporting strategy. I'll also say, be interesting as we look at the election. If Jeb Bush is going to be running, one of the things we didn't talk about was in the quote Hispanic community, the difference between Cuban Americans, people from Latin America, people from Mexico. These are not the same community, not at all. And when it comes to politics, I think they're going to be coming from very different places. So again, just like African American versus Afro-Caribbean
versus white.
And by the way, if you want to do that story, I can direct you to some great neighborhoods in Broward County.
Really?
Where, there's a lot of tension. A lot of tension.
Yes.
Anyway, great discussion. Thank you for leading it. We have a mug for you from
Thank you.
Illinois Studios.